with the most airplanes that are affected by these destructive and criminal measures. To evade their international responsibility given these crimes that were committed, however, financial rules have been imposed on this whole range of unilateral coercive measures that claim to avoid the emission of known licenses. In reality, these licenses, and in some cases, were just a euphemism presented as to cover supposed humanitarian exemptions. This is a mechanism of economic neocolonialism, which establishes conditions for states that are harmed and adjusts them to the political and economic interests of the private corporations and the government of the aggressor state. In short, what we're dealing with here is licenses or concessions to dominate, to administer pain, to deepen and extend the time of the structural ties of dependency economically and financially, sustained by an international system which is unfair and designed, tailor-made to the interests of the North, to undermine the sovereignty and self-determination of peoples. Mr. President, given the application of coercive measures, Venezuela has made significant progress in achieving the SDGs, and with that, there has been optimism and an optimal and timely achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. This progress has been affected, however, by the extortionist policies of the United States and other governments that are subservient to its imperial interests and so-called domination. Today, the recovery of the Venezuelan people is due to its own effort. With dignity and morally, it's claiming its possibility to lift itself beyond the criminal sanctions and to lift off with greater strength and fully exercise its right to development. The blockade against financial transactions in the areas of food, healthcare, education, and public services that have been widespread since 2016 have translated into real restrictions that continue today. They persist. And this is different from what the aggressors would say to international public opinion. And with the support of huge media corporations that are trying to turn our faces away and make us not see this. All of this is part of a policy of maximum cruelty, which is calculated to create as much pain and suffering as possible for all of Venezuelan society. It's truly collective punishment due to which either earlier or later, the promoters will have to be held accountable before international justice. Now, despite all of their attacks, aggressions, undermining and pillaging, which are reflected in this cruel and inhuman measures, unilateral coercive measures imposed on our country, the government of President Maduro has never set aside what we consider to be most essential, and that is the protection of our people through social investment. Mr. President, unilateral coercive measures have been focused on blocking and confiscating the Venezuelan state's assets abroad through an international financial system and arbitrary tribunals in foreign countries. And this has been done in combination with a strategy of aggression using force or the threat of the use of force, thereby undermining and jeopardizing international law and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. In the case of Venezuela, the so-called sanctions operate as a sort of curtain, a cover or veil to hide the criminal operations of theft and looting of our country's assets. And that's why we see the need and duty here to denounce from this august tribune the attempt of illegally stripping our country of its main assets, which is the seventh largest oil company and this is a company which is indisputably a sovereign patrimony of the Venezuelan people. And here we're referring to the company called Citgo Petroleum Corporation, which is the main asset of Venezuela in the United States and property of the Venezuelan oil state, which has been blocked since 2019 and due to the war operations, the lawfare, as it's called in the United States, by the Delaware Tribunal with the support of fictitious entities which are only recognized by Washington and supposed Venezuelan representatives, is now very much at risk of being undermined to the benefit of U.S. and Canadian corporations. It's for this reason that in this very room, we disassociated ourselves from the election of the president in this General Assembly. They're perpetuating the farce in order to continue with their local agents, continue looting all the assets of our people and our country and beyond. We cannot but mention also the impact of sanctions on the economy and global and regional development. Energy security has been seriously impacted by these measures, and here what we see is the productive capacity of the country with the greatest oil reserves in the world impacted. The coercive program, which is the most fabulous company of solidarity cooperation in our region, was very much attacked vilely, with the only purpose of creating inhuman damage to a dozen of countries that were participating in this program. Mr. President, in opting for sovereignty and the exercise its inalienable right to self-determination, and in opting for our right to freely elect our governance system and economic model that suits us, the Venezuelan people have shown that dignity has no price. And that is why all the unilateral coercive measures have failed. And in the future, they are destined to continue failing spectacularly, not only for the good of Venezuela, but also given the accelerated erosion of the supremacist and arrogant spirit behind those who impose these illegal, cruel, inhuman, and genocidal measures. Every day that this policy continues against Venezuela, alternative capacity of economics, political, social, and cultural development of its people will be empowered and made a reality. For each measure which seeks to freeze an asset, a service, monetary value, or transaction, Venezuela will unleash a whole torrent of new opportunities. To demonstrate this, let me give you one example that suffices. At the moment of the blockade of the economic war against Venezuela, the nation was able to achieve a 95% index. Although there are continued challenges, this number has then been invested, and we now have 97% of food self-sufficiency and self-supply in our country, even though they tried to strip us of our supplies. Today, with our own efforts, the Venezuelan economy has begun a process of recovery with figures that are quite higher, much higher than other countries in the region, as set forth by ECLAC and other specialized bodies. Their data indicates this. Mr. President, on the 28th of July, Venezuela will hold presidential elections for the period 2025 to 2023. The electoral environment of peace and civic duty will lead to 11 candidates and 37 political parties in this election, which represents an ideological spectrum and national policy and is providing a great political public debate today in our country, in the streets of Venezuela. The sanctions, which were stimulated and supported by the political opposition, which are servile and directed by Washington, are at the center of this electoral debate. No doubt they will lose in the electoral failure, and there will be a failure of the attempt to impose on the Venezuelan people a colonial regime with fascist practices, which is absolutely anachronic given the Monroe Doctrine, which pretends to convert us into their back door. The sanctions and anti-democratic model, neoliberal model of Hungary, poverty, pain and suffering and coercion will be overcome once again and fail. And the Bolivarian principles of sovereignty and independence most likely will prevail in our elections, bringing President Maduro to yet another presidential term. The 20th of July, we will see a confirmation in our elections of a resounding democratic cry, a popular cry that the United Nations should hear, should listen to and recognize. It will be a shout that sums up the request of all the values and principles of the United Nations Charter. It is an imperative that is aware that international law, and with the clamor, the popular clamor of the heroic Venezuelan people will be declaring victory firmly, no to sanctions.
I thank the distinguished foreign minister.
We were listening to the Venezuelan Foreign Affairs Minister, Yván, speaking just moments ago before the UN General Assembly against the unilateral coercive measures imposed on his country. In his address, the Venezuelan diplomat argued against the existence of such measures, stressing they constitute a crime against the human rights of the peoples of the targeted nations that calls for a global solution. Furthermore, he